3. Me.
Me, 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 me.
You.
I.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. On the 11th day of Flipmas, Watchtower gave to me 11 Pied Pipers led rats down the street. They dance like marionettes, swaying to the symphony of destruction. You take a mortal man, you put him in control. Watch him become a god. Watch people's heads a-roll. 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 10 Pharisees adding 9, boxes checking 8, saints a-milking 7, halls a-selling 666, dedication 5, golden apostasies. 4 publishers, 3 judicial hands, 2 witnesses, and part truth in an everlasting life tree. In the original song, Symphony of Destruction, 12 Days of Christmas, that was rumored to be created as a covert way to remember the tenets of Christianity.
Though now debunked.
Yeah, well, we're almost done now, so we might as well finish it. But in the original song, the 12 Days of Christmas, the 11 Pied Pipers were said to represent the faithful 11 apostles. The Insight book says of 11.
No.
Again?
Nothing.
No 11, no apostles?
No, nothing.
Well, maybe it says something about apostles, since it doesn't say anything about 11.
The Greek word apostolos is derived from the common verb apostello, meaning simply send forth or off. Its basic sense is clearly illustrated in Jesus' statement, "A slave is not greater than his master, nor is one that is sent forth," apostolos, greater than the one that sent him. Further down, it is evident from Peter's statements that it was then considered that any individual filling the position of an apostle of Jesus Christ must have the qualifications of having been personally conversant with him, having been an eyewitness of his works, his miracles, and particularly his resurrection. In view of this, it can be seen that any apostolic succession would in course of time become an impossibility, unless there were divine action to supply these requirements in each individual case.
So we might think of Paul there, speaking of that last statement of the Insight book, but accompanying any claims would also be powerful works. The Insight book continues.
The rapid influx of apostasy and false doctrine and practices after the death of the apostles shows that any pretended apostolic successors had none of the restraining influence of the apostles.
And Paul speaks of such ones, claiming that they're something based on what they have supposedly seen, and claiming to be something. But under examination, there was no evidence to support their claims. And eventually, there could be no such claims, as 1 Corinthians says such things would be done away with. And all that would remain would be Christian love. And even back then, love was to be the identifying mark, not works, or knowledge, or prophecy. But in any case, no one can claim now to be sent forth as from Christ, as the apostles were. A true Christian can only be happy doing his best to emulate Christ, assisting others in doing the same. But Watchtower continues to assert the governing body's authority as the man behind the curtain. Though they never actually come out and say it.
Though they do enforce it as if they actually have said it.
Right. But instead of saying it, they constantly play the alignment game, comparing themselves with their twisted rendering of different individuals that were sent forth. One they continually bring up in this regard is Moses. And really, he's pretty much the only one they could bring up in this way, as we'll talk about here in a minute. But Moses was a prophet, which in meaning is very similar to apostle. The Insight book says of prophet,
Although the etymology of the Hebrew term for a prophet is uncertain, the use of this distinctive term shows that true prophets were no ordinary announcers, but were spokesmen for God, men of God with inspired messages. The Greek prophetess literally means a speaker out, and thus describes a proclaimer, one who makes known messages attributed to a divine source. Though this includes the thought of a predictor of the future, the fundamental meaning of the word is not that of prediction. Nonetheless, living in harmony with God's will requires that the individual know what Jehovah's revealed purposes for the future are, so that he may bring his ways, desires, and goals into line with that divine will. Hence, in the great majority of cases, the biblical prophets did convey messages that were, directly or indirectly, related to the future.
So these individuals, as prophets, were sent forth with messages from God, much like apostles were by Christ. The Insight book next makes a pretty interesting observation under prophet.
By Samuel's time, word from Jehovah had become rare. There was no vision being spread abroad. With the establishment of the monarchy, an almost continuous line of prophets appears.
So in 1 Samuel 3:1, we see that there wasn't much need to send prophets. And not that the people were doing what they should have been doing, after all, that's why Samuel was sent. But who was he first sent to?
The religious leaders.
Right, Eli.
Yeah.
In those days, they had judges to judge between them, not rule over them. And the priesthood was there to set the godly standard, which they were not doing. But once the Israelites asked for a king, that totally exacerbated the problem of men and their authoritarian dominance. And from that time forward, Jehovah continually needed to send prophets to the hierarchy to set them straight.
So nearly all the prophets after Moses were sent to speak against the leaders of God's organization. So there's no way the Watchtower could realistically point to any of those prophets in supporting their own authority. So that leaves them with flipping Moses' authority into their own authority.
Because he's pretty much the only one left. So let's look at those scriptures to see why that doesn't work. For the first reason, let's go to Exodus 3:11 through 14.
However, Moses said to the true God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I have to bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" To this he said, "Because I shall prove to be with you, and this is the sign for you that it is I who have sent you. After you brought the people out of Egypt, you people will serve the true God on this mountain." Nevertheless, Moses said to the true God, "Suppose I am now come to the sons of Israel, and I do say to them, the God of your forefathers has sent me to you, and they do say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" At this God said to Moses, "I shall prove to be what I shall prove to be." And he added, "This is what you are to say to the sons of Israel, I shall prove to be has sent me to you."
So we see the scenario here where Jehovah selects Moses to go and free the Israelites, or lead the Israelites out, I should say. And Moses is kind of doubtful. Like, you remember, Jehovah, we already tried that once, and they ran me out of town. What happens if I go there again and they say, well, who sent you here? Now you have to remember, the Israelites have been in bondage for 500 years now. It's not like Jehovah's name was something that they didn't know. And we're not going to get into the transliteration of the Tetragrammaton here. But the point is, they knew that name. However, where was he all these years? So Moses pretty much asks, well, if I go to him and I say, well, Jehovah sent me to you guys, and they say, yeah, his name means he causes to become. Well, where's he been all these years? So Moses is, in effect, asking, what if they don't believe that you sent me? And a lot of translations render that, I am that I am. Well, Jehovah isn't quoting Popeye here. He's just not stating his existence. He's telling him, I'll show you who I am. And indeed he did. He enabled Moses with miracles. So, as we talked about with the Apostle Paul, he had evidence of God's backing for him as an apostle. So it was with the prophets. They had God's evidence that he was backing them. And it becomes clearly, obviously so, with Moses. Can the governing body claim any miraculous backing of Jehovah? It doesn't seem to be so. In fact, many of their predictions come up untrue. In the best case scenario, that makes them like Jonah, who proclaimed more than what Jehovah said. Jehovah said, "Go tell them their badness has come before my face." Jonah went beyond and said, "You got 40 more days." Not what Jehovah said. So, what proof do they have that Jehovah's backing them? For the second reason they can't compare themselves to Moses, let's go to Exodus 20:18.
Now all the people were seeing the thunders and the lightning flashes and the sound of the horn and the mountain smoking. When the people got to see it, then they quivered and stood at a distance. And they began to say to Moses, "You speak with us, and let us listen, but let not God speak with us, for fear we may die." So Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, because for the sake of putting you to the test, the true God has come, and in order that the fear of him may continue before your faces, that you may not sin." And the people kept standing at a distance, but Moses went near to the dark cloud mass where the true God was.
So here we see that not only does Jehovah select Moses ahead of time, and then all the miracles happen, and he leads them through the Red Sea and to the mountain here, but now the people as a whole select Moses themselves as a mediator. So in what way have we, or has any one of Jehovah's Witnesses for that matter, selected the governing body as a mediator? Except for maybe by their sly Flipmas dedication, where they manipulate the wording of Isaiah 43:10 into a dedication to an organization, which, as we just called the branch to get confirmation, they deny. So for the third reason why they cannot compare themselves to Moses. Numbers 11:24.
After that, Moses went out and spoke to the people the words of Jehovah. And he went gathering 70 men from the older men of the people and proceeded to have them stand round about the tent. Then Jehovah came down in a cloud and spoke to them and took away some of the spirit that was upon him and put it upon each of the 70 older men. And it came about that as soon as the spirit settled down upon them, then they proceeded to act as prophets, but they did not do it again. Now there were 2 of the men remaining in the camp. The name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the other was Medad, and the Spirit began to settle down upon them as they were among those written down. But they had not gone out of the tent, so they proceeded to act as prophets in the camp. And a young man went running and reporting to Moses and saying, "Eldad and Medad are acting as prophets in the camp." Then Joshua the son of Nun, the minister of Moses from his young manhood on, responded and said, "My lord Moses, restrain them." However, Moses said to him, "Are you feeling jealous for me? No, I wish that all of Jehovah's people were prophets, because Jehovah would put his spirit upon them."
So here we see Moses a little overwhelmed with all that he has to do. Jehovah has his spirit taken from him to some degree and given to these other individuals so that they can do the task they have. And when 2 of the selected men start behaving as prophets, Joshua gets a little bent out of shape and says, "Moses, restrain them." Moses was called at one time the meekest man who was on the face of the earth. And this response shows why. I wish they all Jehovah's people were prophets, because Jehovah would put his spirit upon them. Is that the attitude that the governing body has, that they wish all had Jehovah's spirit? Do they accept truth from some underling? Or do they go about killing anyone who speaks something different than they do? Especially considering they claim that they're not infallible, and someone else may be speaking what's correct compared to them. For the fourth reason, comparing themselves to Moses doesn't work. Numbers 12:1-3.
Now Miriam and Aaron began to speak against Moses on account of the Cushite wife whom he had taken, because it was a Cushite wife he had taken. And they kept saying, "Is it just by Moses alone that Jehovah has spoken? Is it not by us also that he has spoken?" And Jehovah was listening. And the man Moses was by far the meekest of all the men who were upon the surface of the ground.
So we see here Moses takes a Cushite wife, something that would later be a matter against written law. But this is before the law was written down. However, it should also be noted that there was no written law necessary for Joseph to know that it would be wrong to sin against God and sleep with Potiphar's wife. So given that both Miriam and Aaron viewed this as wrong, it stands to reason that everyone knew that this marriage is not something that was generally approved of. Was Moses becoming a little brazen about his position, taking liberties that would be considered unacceptable for others? Another note here is that Miriam and Aaron both were saying, "Is it just by Moses that Jehovah has spoken?" which we'll elaborate on later. But then verse 3 follows that at the time Moses was the meekest man of the earth, which we'll also get into a bit later. So continuing with verse 4.
Then Jehovah suddenly said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, "Go out, the three of you, to the tent of meeting." So the three of them went out. After that, Jehovah came down in the pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam. At this, both of them went out.
So we're stopping there because we see something rather obvious here. Does the governing body have anything similar to a pillar of cloud that comes down in their Wednesday meeting with the magic 8-ball? But in trying to stretch this comparison, the February Watchtower of 2017 makes this ridiculous statement. In paragraph 7, it states, "The Bible does not report that the Israelites saw a materialized angel perform those duties. However, the way Moses instructed and guided the people made it clear that he had superhuman help." With a word shuffle, they make it seem like just because a materialized angel didn't show up, that there was no physical representation to show that God was using Moses. However, 1 Corinthians 10:1-4 clearly shows Christ's involvement in guiding the Israelites, mentioning the rock mass, mentioning the cloud itself. And I made such a comment to the visiting wife speaker when she said that to us after the meeting. "Well, there was no visible representation in Moses' day." Yeah, except for the big cloud of fire and smoke. In our judicial committee meeting, an elder asked, "Well, why would you say that?" Because it's true. Because what they're saying in trying to manipulate the scripture to say something it doesn't say, it isn't true. There was most certainly a visible representation there, and if what 1 Corinthians 10:1-4 says is true, then absolutely there was a divine representative there, guiding Moses. In any case, it most certainly was a visible representation. Does the governing body have any such visible representation? Carrying on in verse 6, which will end up being huge, especially when we link it back to Deuteronomy 18:20-22.
And he went on to say, "Hear my words, please. If there came to be a prophet of yours for Jehovah, it would be in a vision I would make myself known to him. In a dream I would speak to him. Not so my servant Moses. He is being entrusted with all my house. Mouth to mouth I speak to him, thus showing him, and not by riddles. And the appearance of Jehovah is what he beholds. Why then did you not fear to speak against my servant, against Moses?" And Jehovah's anger got to be hot against them, and he went his way.
So this is the reason that Jehovah gives for not speaking against Moses. Yes, he was in charge of all his house, but more importantly, he didn't speak to him with riddles or visions like other prophets. It was, as the scripture says, mouth to mouth. Can the governing body claim anything even close to this? Continuing in verse 10.
And the cloud turned away from over the tent, and look, Miriam was struck with leprosy, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned toward Miriam, and look, she was struck with leprosy.
We mentioned this earlier that both Aaron and Miriam spoke against Moses, but here only Miriam got the leprosy. Why is that? Well, we know that Jehovah is a reader of hearts, who gives to each one according to his ways. So was it only Miriam that actually thought of usurping instead of just warning Moses? Or perhaps it's the repentance he shows in verse 11. Of course, we can't know for sure, but we do know Moses was said to be the meekest of all the earth at the time, and he proves it in verse 12.
Immediately Aaron said to Moses, "Excuse me, my lord. Do not please attribute to us the sin in which we have acted foolishly and which we have committed. Please do not let her continue like someone dead, whose flesh at the time of his coming out of his mother's womb is half eaten off." And Moses began to cry out to Jehovah, saying, "O God, please heal her, please."
So here we see in 13, Moses pleads for them, as a mediator should. And notice it wasn't Moses who acted out anything against them. He left it in Jehovah's hands. And again, he pleaded as a mediator should in their behalf. The last situation we'll bring out is with Korah. Now, when we speak of Korah, we're going to be talking about Korah in the sense of all those who are with them, Dathan and Abiram, all those guys. But we'll just say Korah for the sake of keeping things brief. But it begins in Numbers 16:1. And oh, does Watchtower love to use this circumstance of Korah to scare the daylights out of witnesses. So let's read through this and see how it doesn't necessarily apply to them with Moses.
And Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, proceeded to get up together with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, the sons of Reuben. And they proceeded to rise up before Moses, they and 250 men of the sons of Israel, chieftains of the assembly, summoned ones of the meeting, men of fame. So they congregated themselves against Moses and Aaron, and said to them, "That is enough of you, because the whole assembly are all of them holy, and Jehovah is in their midst. Why then should you lift yourselves up above the congregation of Jehovah?"
So let's stop there for a moment, because we want to toss this out there. Is it possible that these 250 men rose up for a reason? Was there something to Moses getting a little bit haughty? After all, look what eventually happened to Moses after taking credit for what Jehovah did at the waters of Meribah. So was it true that Moses was slipping back into his old ways? I mean, look what he did back in Egypt before he went off into the wilderness, taking things into his own hands. So was he losing some of that humility and meekness that he had when God first called him? It's just something to consider in the dynamics. Carrying on.
When Moses got to hear it, he at once fell upon his face. Then he spoke to Korah and to his entire assembly, saying, "In the morning Jehovah will make known who belongs to him, and who is holy, and who must come near to him, and whoever he may choose will come near to him. Do this, take fire holders for yourselves, Korah and his entire assembly, and put fire in them and place incense upon them before Jehovah tomorrow. And it must occur that the man whom Jehovah will choose, he is the Holy One. That is enough of you, you sons of Levi." And Moses went on to say to Korah, "Listen, please, you sons of Levi. Is it such a little thing for you men that the God of Israel has separated you men from the assembly of Israel to present you to himself to carry on the service of Jehovah's tabernacle, and to stand before the assembly to minister to them? And that he should bring you and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you near? So must you men also try to secure the priesthood? For that reason, you and all your assembly who are gathering together are against Jehovah. As for Aaron, what is he that you men should murmur against him?" Later Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We are not going to come up." "Is it so little a thing that you have brought us up out of the land flowing with milk and honey to put us to death in the wilderness, that you should also try to play the prince over us to the limit? As it is, you have not brought us into any land flowing with milk and honey, that you may give us an inheritance of field and vineyard. Is it the eyes of those men that you want to bore out? We are not going to come up." At this Moses became very angry and said to Jehovah, "Do not turn to look at their grain offering. Not one male ass have I taken away from them, nor have I harmed one of them."
So we should stop there because there are a few things that kind of happen here. One, what happened to the humble Moses who was pleading in behalf for Aaron and Miriam and wasn't ready to step in and do anything to them? Not only that, verse 14 makes a pretty interesting statement showing the reputation Moses had gained with a good many of God's people. Bore their eyes out? That seems pretty extreme that they'd even consider that he might think of doing such a thing. But to be fair, Moses defends himself, stating how he hadn't harmed a single one of them or benefited from them at all. Can the governing body say that they haven't harmed any of God's people with their policies? Can they say that they're not benefiting, living in their lakeside condos? So continuing in the verse.
Then Moses said to Korah, "You and all your assembly be present before Jehovah, you and they and Aaron tomorrow. And take each one of his fireholder, and you men must put incense upon them and present each one his fireholder before Jehovah, 250 fireholders, and you and Aaron each his fireholder." So they took each one his fireholder and put fire upon them and placed incense upon them and stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting together with Moses and Aaron. When Korah got all the assembly together against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting, then Jehovah's glory appeared to all the assembly.
Now, keep in mind, what we said in the preceding was not defending Korah. After all the things we mentioned before, miracles and being humble and all those other things, and the fire and smoke, it should have been obvious that Moses was being used by Jehovah. But that's still not to say that Korah couldn't speak his mind in warning Moses about his attitude. Again, Aaron didn't get leprosy along with Miriam before. Whatever the case, at that time before, Moses was one of the meekest of men. And really, in principle, Korah's words weren't that much different than what happened previously when Moses' humility was put to the test with Eldad and Medad. And Moses kept the right attitude in that case. But no doubt, as the pressure mounted from the Israelites, it was getting to him. They continually put him in the place of God, as did Korah, blaming Moses for not leading them to the promised land, as if everything that was going on was by Moses' design and therefore his fault. So was Moses slowly succumbing to that pressure to take credit for it? Perhaps so. But by the time of Korah, he hadn't yet crossed that line, because in verse 28, Moses makes it clear that whatever happens to them wouldn't come from his own hands. He left it in Jehovah's hands, just as he did previously. Go ahead and continue.
Jehovah now spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Separate yourselves from the midst of this assembly, that I may exterminate them in an instant." At this they fell upon their faces and said, "O God, the God of the spirits of every sort of flesh, will just one man sin and you become indignant against the entire assembly?" In turn, Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the assembly, saying, get away from around the tabernacles of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." After that, Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the older men of Israel went with him. Then he spoke to the assembly, saying, "Turn aside, please, from before the tents of these wicked men, and do not touch anything that belongs to them, that you may not be swept away in all their sin." Immediately they got away from before the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram from every side, and Dathan and Abiram came out, taking their stand at the entrance of their tents, together with their wives and their sons and their little ones. Then Moses said, "By this you will know that Jehovah has sent me to do all these deeds, that it is not of my own heart. If it is according to the death of all mankind that these people will die, and with the punishment of all mankind that punishment will be brought upon them, then it is not Jehovah that has sent me. But if it is something created that Jehovah will create, and the ground has to open its mouth and swallow up them and everything that belongs to them, and they have to go down alive into Sheol, you will then know for certain that these men have treated Jehovah disrespectfully."
So remember, it was not Moses who struck Miriam with leprosy. It was Jehovah. In fact, it was Moses who interceded for her in her behalf, as a good mediator would do. But it seems Moses lost a bit of that desire to become that mediator and intercede in the behalf of his brothers, because he only interceded for the crowd in that prayer there, not in behalf of his fellow priest assistants. And Moses sought to make a comparison between himself and Korah and those other men. We aren't vilifying Moses here. Obviously, Korah had a bad motive, because he and those men made the error of taking Moses up on that showdown. Can you imagine if Korah would have continued to say, "Whoa, bro, I'm not saying Jehovah's not using you. We just think you're getting a bit too big for your britches. Remember how well it went with you when you dealt with Eldad and Medad before? You knew Jehovah used them too. Hey, if I'm out of line, please instruct me how I'm wrong, and intercede to Jehovah for me as we selected you for. But as to why you're inciting me against you is between you and Jah, but I'm certainly not going to put myself in comparison to you before Jehovah." If that would have been the way it would have happened, can you imagine how differently we'd be reading about Korah and those men today? But again, that's not the way it went down. Korah and those men must have thought of usurping Moses in the priesthood in that position. Otherwise, he would have never accepted that challenge to put the fire holders before Jehovah, something that henceforth only the priests would be allowed to do. But still, the fact that Moses was gradually losing his humility manifested itself at the waters of Meribah, where he took credit for what God was doing and therefore lost his own opportunity to enter the promised land as well. But again, at that point with Korah, Moses did still show a measure of humility in what he said in response to Korah. He left it up to Jehovah to deal with them. If it comes by a man's hand, you'll know it's not from me. However, if it comes by something created, something that's not of man's hand, then you'll know that Jehovah's been supporting me. Is the governing body through its hierarchy willing to let Jehovah enact the revenge or punishment as Moses was? Nope. In a perfect display of a lack of humility, they execute anyone with questions, not just about their authority, but about anything. It can be doctrinal, it can be a policy, not even having to do with their authority. Something Moses would have never done, even to wicked Korah. Finally, let's read verse 39 and 40, because there's something interesting here that happens after those men were swallowed up by the earth.
Accordingly, Eleazar the priest took the copper fire holders, which those who had been burned up had presented, and they proceeded to beat them out into an overlaying for the altar, as a memorial for the sons of Israel, to the end that no strange man who is not of the offspring of Aaron should come near and make incense smoke before Jehovah, and no one might become like Korah and his assembly, just as Jehovah had spoken to him by means of Moses.
So those fire holders were to become a memorial to the Israelites, that no strange man or Levite should take up the priestly duties. Now, the Levites assisted Aaron and his sons with the priestly duties. So let's say that the anointed fill that priestly role once they're in heaven. But have they begun to rule already? If they presume to take the role of Aaron's sons before it's given to them, how are they not being like Korah or Uzziah with those fire holders? So now do we have priests on the earth mediating for us to Christ? Wasn't that the major argument to Catholics, that we don't have priests anymore? Or has that went out the window with the legally forced acceptance of a clergy class that before they previously said we don't have? Now will they be legally forced to create a priesthood to keep their penitent privilege secrets? Oh, what a satanic web they are letting themselves be weaved into. The final and sixth point why they can't compare themselves to Moses. And while we haven't heard this line of reasoning yet, let's just cut it off at the pass. Let's say that somebody points out that Moses is the typical Jesus, so to speak.
I thought we didn't believe in typical, antitypical anymore.
Yeah, well, that's only when it's inconvenient. So did Moses, the typical Jesus, hand the baton to Joshua after he died? This one goes out to you transliteration buffs. Joshua is actually the exact same name as Jesus. So if anything, Moses, the typical Jesus, hands it off to himself. Just a fun point.
So if they can't claim apostolic succession, and they can't claim prophetic similarity, then these 11 false apostle prophet pipers tooting their own horn are just piping to continue.
The 12th day of Flipmas Watchtower gave to me 12 elders drumming, 11 pipers piping, 10 Pharisees adding, 9 boxes checking, 8 saints a milking, 7 halls a selling, 666 dedication, 5 golden apostasies. 4 publishers, 3 judicial hands, 2 witnesses, and part truth and an everlasting life tree.